Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nocturnal Nightmares. You're tuned into Night Drive horror stories. So, settle in, calm down, relax, and let the shadows creep in as you dim the lights. Get ready to join us on a chilling journey into the unknown. And if you're enjoying the ride, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a frightful moment. It was one of those nights where the rain poured down in sheets, each drop smacking against the windshield with a rhythmic intensity that could lull you into a false sense of calm. But tonight, I was anything but calm. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to the small town where my sister lived. My phone's GPS was useless, the storm had knocked out the signal, and I was relying on my memory and the barely visible road signs to guide me. The road stretched ahead, a narrow, winding path cutting through a dense forest. The trees on either side loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying ominously in the howling wind. The headlights of my car barely penetrated the inky blackness ahead. The rain made everything seem surreal, like I was driving through a nightmare. I had just passed a sign that I thought said, Ravens Hollow, 20 miles, when I saw her. A figure on the side of the road, drenched from head to toe, thumb outstretched, seeking a ride. I almost didn't stop. I mean, who picks up hitchhikers anymore, especially in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this? But something about her made me pause. She looked desperate, terrified even, and I couldn't in good conscience just leave her there. I slowed the car and pulled over, rolling down the passenger window just a crack. The rain lashed against the side of the car, making it hard to see her clearly. She was young. Maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. Need a ride? I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out more nervous than I intended. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and quickly opened the door, sliding into the passenger seat. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. I noticed she wasn't carrying a bag or anything, just herself, drenched and trembling. "Where are you headed?" I asked after a few moments of silence, trying to break the tension. "Anywhere but here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. There was something off about the way she said it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, I'm heading toward Ravens Hollow," I said, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. "Is that good for you?" She nodded again, her gaze fixed straight ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something she wasn't telling me. But I pushed the thought aside and focused on the road. The rain had let up a bit, but it was still coming down hard enough that I had to keep the wipers on full blast. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the constant whoosh of the wipers and the rumble of the tires on the wet pavement. The farther we drove, the more uneasy I became. I kept stealing glances at her, trying to figure out what it was that was bothering me. She was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light of the car, and she still hadn't said more than a few words. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped for me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. "There are things out here in the dark. Things that prey on people like you." And me, I didn't know how to respond to that. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I suddenly wished I hadn't stopped at all. But I forced a smile and tried to brush it off. "You're safe now," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "I'll get you to Ravens Hollow." She didn't say anything else after that, just turned back to stare out the window. But the feeling of dread that had been gnawing at me since I picked her up only grew stronger. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the darkness around us felt oppressive, almost alive. Then I saw it, movement in the trees along the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes, but then I saw it again, something darting between the trees, keeping pace with the car. I hit the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "What is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, but I could see that she was tense. Her eyes wide with fear. Whatever it was getting closer. I could see its shape now, a dark, shadowy figure moving impossibly fast through the trees. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck despite the cool air inside the car. Then it was gone. Just like that, the shadowy figure vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the rain and the road ahead. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but my relief was short-lived. "Don't stop," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "No matter what you see, no matter what happens, don't stop." I nodded, too terrified to argue. I kept my foot on the gas, driving faster than was safe in the rain. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from whatever that thing was as possible. Then the car jerked violently to the side, the tires screeching as they slid on the wet pavement. I fought to regain control, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't seen anything, but it felt like we had hit something big. I glanced over at her, expecting her to tell me to stop, to see what we had hit, but she just shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Keep going," she said, her voice trembling. It's funny how life can change in the blink of an eye. One moment, you're just an ordinary guy making a late-night delivery, and the next, you're fighting the overwhelming urge to slam on the brakes and flee. But I guess that's what happens when you find yourself on a deserted road with a car too close behind, its headlights glaring in your rear view like a pair of hungry eyes. I've been working this gig for years, delivering products to mom-and-pop stores across the city. It's a quiet job, one that usually suits me just fine. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the empty streets. Or maybe it was the unease gnawing at my gut as I left the last store. The sensation that someone, was watching me. I shook it off as paranoia. It's easy to get spooked when you're alone in a van, driving through the dead of night. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic flash of streetlights, the monotony of it all can play tricks on your mind. But when I pulled up to that intersection and noticed the car behind me, a nondescript sedan with its windows tinted too dark to see inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The light turned green, and I drove on, expecting the car to pass. But it didn't. Instead, it kept pace, its headlights growing brighter as it edged closer to my bumper. My pulse quickened. There was no reason for them to be this close. The other lane was wide open, but they stayed behind me, their lights like daggers piercing the night. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were in a hurry. But as the minutes ticked by and the car stayed glued to my tail, the tension in my chest tightened into a knot. I tried to shake it off, focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, watching, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until I noticed the road narrowing, the trees on either side closing in like a dark tunnel, that the fear began to take hold. I knew this route well, I'd driven it countless times before. But tonight, it felt different. The road seemed longer, the shadows darker, and the car behind me more menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowed the van, hoping the car would pass. But instead, it slowed too, maintaining the same unervingly close distance. My palms slicked with sweat as I gripped the wheel tighter, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. Who were they? What did they want? Was this just a random act of road rage or something far more sinister? The road ahead was empty. A stretch of asphalt bathed in moonlight, but it offered no comfort. I could feel the weight of the car's presence behind me, its engine humming like a predator stalking its prey. My breath quickened, and I had to force myself to stay calm, to think clearly. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the flicker of movement in the trees. A shadow, there and gone in an instant. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the roadside, but there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the branches. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but the chill running down my spine told me otherwise. I had to do something. I couldn't just keep driving, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. With a deep breath, I made a decision. I'd pull over, make them pass, and put an end to this unsettling game. But as I signaled and started to slow down, the car behind me sped up, swerving into the other lane and pulling up beside me. My heart leaped into my throat as I glanced over, but the windows were too dark, the interior hidden in shadow. For a split second, we were side by side, and then, with a screech of tires, they swerved back behind me, cutting me off from pulling over. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some impatient driver. This was deliberate. I slammed on the gas, my only thought to get away, but the car kept pace, its engine roaring as it matched my speed. We raced down the road, the van's tires squealing as I took a sharp turn, the car right on my tail, the trees blurred past, the road twisting and turning, but I couldn't shake them. They were always there, just behind me, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but every option felt like a trap. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, and the only sound in the night was the pounding of my heart and the roar of our engines. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The car behind me slowed, then veered off down a side road, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. I just kept driving, my eyes glued to the road ahead, my hands trembling on the wheel. It wasn't until I reached the warehouse, the van skidding to a halt in the parking lot, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My heart was still racing, my mind still reeling from the terror of it all. But I was safe. I was alive. As I sat there, the engine ticking in the cool night air, I couldn't help but wonder, what if they hadn't left? What if they'd caught me? Would I be here now, telling this story, or would I be just another missing person? Lost to the darkness of that lonely road, I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never take the night shift again. Not after tonight. Not after the night drive that nearly became my last. It's strange how some decisions stick with you, haunting your every thought, even when you're convinced you did the right thing. I've always been the cautious type, the kind of person who plays it safe, who doesn't take unnecessary risks. But on that cold, foggy night, something made me break my own rules, a decision I still can't fully explain, and one I'll never forget. I had been on the road for hours, making my way back home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town. The night was thick with fog, so dense that my headlights barely cut through it. The world outside was a blur of shadows and swirling mist, with the occasional silhouette of a tree flashing by as I navigated the winding road. It was the kind of night that made you feel isolated, like you were the only person left in the world. I had just passed a sign indicating that I was still miles away from the nearest town when I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, barely visible in the fog, standing next to a beat-up old suitcase. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood, his posture slouched as if he had been waiting there for a long time. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about him, maybe it was the way he just stood there, alone in the mist, made me slow down. I rolled down the window, just a crack, enough to ask if he needed a ride. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he was heading to the next town. He didn't look dangerous, just tired, like he'd been on the road for days. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door and told him to get in. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the creeping dread that was slowly wrapping itself around me. The fog outside seemed to press in closer, the shadows dancing in the corners of my vision. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting for a reaction. Then, suddenly, he turned to me, his face still hidden in the shadows, and asked if I'd ever picked up a hitchhiker before. His tone was casual, but there was something in the way he said it that sent a jolt of fear through me. I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. He smiled then, a slow, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. He said that was good, because not everyone you meet on the road is what they seem. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting back to the road, and the silence between us grew heavier, more suffocating. We drove on for what felt like hours, the road stretching out endlessly before us. I kept glancing at the clock, but the hands barely seemed to move. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the road ahead, my headlights swallowed up by the darkness. The hitchhiker sat quietly beside me, his presence a constant, oppressive weight. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fog began to lift. The shadows receded, the road became clearer, and up ahead, I could see the faint lights of the town. Relief flooded through me, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. As we approached the town, the hitchhiker shifted in his seat, reaching for his suitcase. He didn't say a word, just nodded as I pulled over to the side of the road. I unlocked the doors, and he stepped out into the night, his figure disappearing into the mist as quickly as he had appeared. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The town was just a few miles away, and I'd be home soon, back in the safety of my own bed. But as I drove away, something caught my eye, a dark shape lying in the middle of the road up ahead. My heart skipped a beat as I slowed down, the shape becoming clearer in the headlights. It was a suitcase, the same beat-up old suitcase the hitchhiker had been carrying. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was empty, the contents strewn across the road, as if it had been there for a long, long time. I sped up, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. I drove straight through the town, not stopping until I reached my driveway, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As I finally made it inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the windows, the shadows in the corners of my home feeling darker than usual. I never saw the hitchhiker again, but every time I drive that road, I can't help but feel a pair of eyes watching me from the fog, waiting for me to make the same mistake again. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind where the rain pelts down in sheets and the wind howls through the trees. I sat in my car, hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel as I navigated the slick roads. The only sound was the pounding of rain on the roof of my car, and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. I had been driving for what felt like hours, the rain seeming to never let up. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard and saw that it was nearing midnight. I had been on this road for too long, the unfamiliar surroundings only adding to my growing sense of unease. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows behind me. But each time I looked, there was nothing there but the empty road disappearing into the darkness. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the road ahead of me, illuminated by the headlights of my car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest as I came to a stop just a few feet away from the figure. It was a woman, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, her clothes soaked through. She stood there, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that there was something not quite right about this woman. She seemed to be swaying slightly, as if she was being buffeted by a strong wind, though the trees around us were completely still. And then, as I watched in horror, her features began to distort and shift, as if the rain was melting her away. I quickly put the car in reverse, wanting to get as far away from this strange apparition as possible. But as I began to back up, I heard a thud from the back of the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure crawling out from the trunk, its movements jerky and unnatural. I let out a scream of terror as I realized that I was surrounded by these ghostly figures, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. I tried to drive away, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, the rain pounding down even harder now, as if trying to wash away all trace of me. I could hear their whispers now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from all directions. They spoke of pain and suffering, of lost souls doomed to wander this endless road for all eternity. And as they closed in on me, their hands reaching out towards the car, I knew that I was doomed to join them. In a last desperate attempt to escape, I slammed on the gas pedal, my heart racing as I sped down the road. The figures chased after me, their ghostly forms shimmering in the headlights of my car. But no matter how fast I drove, they were always right behind me, their twisted faces contorted in agony. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the rain suddenly stopped. The road ahead of me seemed to stretch on infinitely, disappearing into a swirling mist that seemed to be swallowing everything in its path. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, as if the storm had passed and I was finally safe, but as I drove on, the mist grew thicker and thicker, until I could barely see the road in front of me. And then, just as I was about to panic, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger and brighter as I approached, until I could see that it was a small cabin nestled in the trees. I pulled up in front of the cabin, my heart still pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking as I approached the cabin door. And as I reached out to knock, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, my eyes widening in shock as I saw the figures standing there before me. But instead of reaching out to grab me, they simply nodded, their faces now peaceful and serene. And then, as one, they turned and walked into the mist, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, letting out a shaky breath as I realized that I was finally safe. I knocked on the cabin door, my heart still racing as I waited for someone to answer. And when the door finally opened, revealing a kindly old man with a warm smile on his face, I knew that I had found sanctuary in the midst of the storm. As I sat in my car on a rainy night, the steady pitter-patter of rain on the windshield creating a calming rhythm, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The darkness outside seemed to swallow up the edges of my headlights, leaving me feeling isolated and vulnerable on the deserted road. I had heard stories of strange happenings on this stretch of road, tales of ghostly figures that appeared in the middle of the night, causing unsuspecting drivers to swerve off the road in fear. I always dismissed these stories as mere legends, the product of overactive imaginations and too many horror movies, but as I navigated the slick roads, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move and shift in the corners of my vision, like malevolent spirits waiting to pounce. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the beam of my headlights, causing me to slam on the brakes and swerve to avoid hitting them. My heart racing, I looked in the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. I forced myself to calm down, chalking it up to fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the rainy night. But as I continued on my journey, the feeling of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. The rain pounded on the roof of my car, the sound a relentless reminder of the night's darkness. I felt like I was in a cocoon of isolation, the world outside reduced to a blur of water and shadows. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing a figure standing in the middle of the lane. I gasped in shock, swerving to avoid hitting them and skidding to a stop on the slick pavement. As I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized that the figure was not alone. More shapes emerged from the darkness, surrounding my car in a circle of eerie silence. Their eyes glittered with malice, their mouths twisted into sinister grins. I tried to start the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. But the engine refused to turn over, leaving me stranded in the middle of the road with the dark figures closing in. I could hear their whispering voices now, a cacophony of sinister laughter and taunts. Panic gripped me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I realized that I was at the mercy of whatever malevolent force had chosen to trap me on this rainy night. As the figures drew closer, their features becoming clearer in the dim light, I saw that they were not human. Their twisted bodies and grotesque faces sent a shiver down my spine, filling me with a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. I closed my eyes, praying for a miracle, for some way to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the figures were right outside my car, their hands reaching for the door handles with clawed fingers. With a scream of terror, I lunged for the passenger side door, wrenching it open and scrambling out into the rain. I ran blindly into the darkness, the sound of pursuit echoing behind me as I fled for my life. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone as I stumbled through the night. I could hear the figures behind me, their unearthly howls sending a shiver of dread down my spine. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I saw the faint glow of lights up ahead. With a surge of desperate hope, I pushed myself forward, the sound of my pursuers growing fainter as I drew closer to safety. As I reached the lights, I saw that they belonged to a small roadside diner, its windows warm and inviting in the darkness. I burst through the door, panting and wild-eyed, the other patrons staring at me in shock. I collapsed into a chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to explain what had happened to me. But when I looked back out into the rainy night, the figures were gone, leaving me to wonder if they had ever been there at all. To this day, I still shudder at the memory of that rainy night drive, the horror of it etched into my mind like a scar. I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our darkest fears, waiting to strike when we least expect it. And I pray that I never have to face them again. I'm a 34-year-old courier, and the majority of my shifts involve driving late into the night. My route takes me through both bustling city streets and the more desolate outskirts. I enjoy the solitude of the night shift, it allows me to think clearly and keep to my own rhythm. However, the stillness of the late hours can sometimes lead to unsettling experiences. One clear night in late autumn, after a particularly long day of deliveries, I was heading home. My van was loaded with nothing but empty packages and the remnants of a busy day. It was around 11 p.m. when I turned onto a quiet, rural road that stretched endlessly through the countryside. The road was framed by tall trees, their branches bare and skeletal in the moonlight. The peaceful silence was abruptly shattered by a loud pop that echoed through the van. I felt a sudden jolt, and the steering wheel wobbled violently. My heart sank as I realized I had a flat tire. I carefully maneuvered the van to the side of the road, where the sparse light of the moon barely touched the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and tool kit from the back of the van and stepped out into the chilly night air. The ground was uneven, and the gravel crunched underfoot as I walked around to the rear of the vehicle. I set up my tools and shone the flashlight on the flat tire. The beam cast long shadows, and the darkness beyond seemed almost alive, writhing and shifting with the rustling leaves. As I began loosening the lug nuts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The night was too quiet, too still. Every so often, I thought I heard a faint rustling, but when I looked up, there was nothing, just the empty road and the encroaching darkness. I dismissed the noises as the wind or perhaps a small animal. I worked quickly, trying to get the job done before my anxiety could build further. The flashlight's beam flickered intermittently, causing the shadows to dance eerily around me. As I struggled with the stubborn lug nuts, the rustling noise grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't just the wind anymore, it sounded like footsteps moving through the underbrush. My heartbeat quickened. I glanced over my shoulder, but the flashlight illuminated nothing but the shadows of trees and shrubs. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, and I could feel the weight of the approaching presence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A dark figure emerged from the tree line, partially obscured by the thick foliage. The figure was clad in a hooded sweatshirt, their face hidden in the shadows of the hood. They stopped a few feet away from me, standing perfectly still, their gaze directed at me with unsettling intensity. Panic surged through me. I tried to focus on finishing the tire change, but the presence of the figure made it difficult to concentrate. I fumbled with the last lug nut, my fingers slick with sweat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with an unblinking stare. I knew I needed to get out of there, and fast. As soon as I had the new tire secured, I quickly gathered my tools and headed back to the van. The figure remained in place, their silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of trees. My flashlight cast erratic beams as I hurried, and every shadow seemed to come alive with potential threats. I jumped into the van and started the engine, the comforting rumble of the vehicle providing a temporary shield against the encroaching fear. As I reversed, I glanced back one last time. The figure was still standing there, their presence a haunting memory against the dark. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after me. The road stretched on, the occasional streetlight offering brief moments of relief from the oppressive darkness. The feeling of being followed lingered, an unsettling weight that refused to lift. When I finally reached the safety of the warehouse, I was still shaken. The quiet drive home had turned into a nerve-wracking ordeal, and the flat tire had become a mere footnote in a night filled with fear. I couldn't shake the image of the figure watching me, a ghostly reminder of the solitude and unpredictability of late-night driving. As I parked the van and prepared to leave for the night, I glanced back at the road I had traveled. The memory of that eerie encounter stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the potential dangers that lurk in the stillness of the night. As I got into my car and started driving, the rain began to pour down heavily. It was a dark and stormy night, with the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. The visibility was low, making it difficult to see the road ahead. But despite the treacherous weather, I had no choice but to make the hour-long drive home. As I drove along the deserted road, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The rain pounded against the windshield, creating an eerie sound that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept wandering to the stories I had heard about this stretch of road at night. Legend had it that there was a ghostly figure that haunted this road, appearing in the middle of the night to unsuspecting drivers. Some said it was the spirit of a woman who had died in a car accident on that very road, while others claimed it was a vengeful spirit seeking revenge on those who dared to drive there at night. I tried to brush off the stories as mere superstition, but as the rain continued to fall and the darkness closed in around me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep over me. I could swear that I saw shadows moving in the darkness, and that the rain sounded like whispers in the wind. As I approached a bend in the road, a flash of lightning illuminated the path ahead, revealing a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. But as quickly as the figure had appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I sat frozen in my seat, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Was it just a trick of the light, or had I really seen something out there in the dark? I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that something was not right. As I continued my drive, the rain seemed to intensify, pounding against the car with a ferocity that made it difficult to hear anything else. I felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of my stomach, as if something sinister was lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the car, causing me to jump in my seat. I looked in the rearview mirror, only to see nothing but darkness behind me. But as I turned my gaze back to the road ahead, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I let out a scream as I swerved to avoid the creature, the car skidding dangerously on the slick road. I could hear a faint scratching sound coming from outside the car, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. I pressed down on the gas pedal, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever lurked in the darkness, but no matter how fast I drove, the creature seemed to keep pace with me, its glowing eyes following me wherever I went. I could feel its malevolent gaze boring into me, sending a chill down my spine that I couldn't shake. As I approached a bridge that spanned a deep ravine, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road once again, its form twisted and monstrous in the dim light. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches away from the creature. I could see its twisted limbs reaching out towards me, its eyes burning with a fiery intensity that made my blood run cold. I knew then that this was no mere ghost or figment of my imagination. This was something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for me all along. With a sinking feeling in my chest, I realized that I was not going to make it out of this alive. The creature let out a guttural growl, its mouth opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. And as it lunged towards me, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed, my body battered and bruised from the crash. The doctors told me that they had found me unconscious at the scene of the accident, my car wrapped around a tree at the edge of the ravine, but as I lay there, trying to make sense of what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting in the darkness for its next victim. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I knew that I would never forget the horrors of that 1 hour of rainy night drive. It seems ridiculous now, but at the time, I genuinely believed it was just a coincidence. The night was quiet, and the streets were mostly empty as I made my way to the final delivery of the evening. I was working a late shift, delivering pizzas to houses scattered across the city, and I was looking forward to clocking out and heading home. My shift had dragged on for what felt like an eternity, and the thought of curling up on the couch was the only thing keeping me going. The last order of the night came in just as I was about to call it quits. The address was on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. I didn't think much of it, just another delivery to complete before I could finally go home. But as I drove through the dimly lit streets, a car pulled up behind me at an intersection. It wasn't unusual for cars to be behind me on these late-night runs, but something about the way this one stuck close made me uneasy. When the light turned green, I continued driving, expecting the car to pass me at some point. But it didn't. It stayed behind me, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I tried to shrug it off as nothing. Maybe the driver was just in a hurry and didn't want to overtake a slow-moving delivery van. But when I turned onto a smaller road that led to the neighborhood, the car turned with me, maintaining its distance but never straying too far. My unease grew with each passing minute. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the delivery ahead, but the car's presence gnawed at the back of my mind. It followed me all the way to the neighborhood, where I was finally able to pull off to the side of the road. As soon as I parked, the car behind me stopped as well, pulling off to the side just a short distance away. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up my spine. It's just a coincidence, I told myself, trying to calm the nervous flutter in my chest. I grabbed the pizza box and stepped out of the van, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The house I was delivering to looked like any other, slightly run down, with an overgrown lawn and peeling paint on the walls. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a quiet, forgotten neighborhood like this. I walked up to the front porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The dim porch light flickered above me, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer. I knocked again, this time a bit harder, hoping to rouse whoever was inside. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally creaked open. A man stood there, blinking at me like he'd just woken up. He wasn't the guy who had ordered the pizza back at the shop. That much I knew for sure. The man I was looking at now seemed disoriented, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his clothes disheveled. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and the smell of alcohol wafted out of the house. "I've got a Domino's delivery for Matthew," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man just stared at me for a moment, his gaze unfocused. Then, as if snapping out of a daze, he nodded slowly. Yeah, of course. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice quiet and shaky. He reached out for the pizza, his hand trembling slightly. As I handed it to him, he looked like he was going to say something else, but no words came out. He just stood there, holding the pizza, his dull eyes fixed on me. The whole situation felt off, like I was in some kind of weird dream. I was about to ask if everything was okay when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a guy in a hood jogging down the sidewalk, just 2 houses away. He wasn't just out for a late-night run, he was staring right at us. The pit in my stomach grew as I quickly turned back toward my van. The man at the door seemed to notice the hooded figure too, because he stepped out onto the porch like he was going to follow me. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to get the door open. But before I could get in, the guy in the hood suddenly veered off the sidewalk and ran right behind my car, blocking my escape. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. The man on the porch started running toward me. And I knew I had to act fast. In the heat of the moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I floored the gas pedal, throwing the van into reverse. The guy behind the car jumped out of the way just in time, but both of them started yelling and chasing after me as I backed out onto the street. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I tried to keep the van under control. As I backed up, I caught a glimpse of the hooded man under the streetlight. It was the same guy who had come into the pizza shop earlier. They had planned this. They had waited for me to make the delivery so they could trap me. My hands were shaking as I threw the van into drive and sped away. The tires screeching against the pavement, I could see them running after me in the rearview mirror, their faces twisted with anger and desperation. I didn't stop until I was far enough away, my mind racing with what had just happened. As soon as I felt safe, I pulled over and called the cops, my hands still trembling as I recounted the events of the night. It didn't take long for the police to track down the two men. They were arrested within the hour, charged with attempted robbery. It turned out they had been planning to rob me, thinking that because they ordered the pizza from the shop, we wouldn't be able to trace it back to them. They were drunk, their plans sloppy and poorly thought out, but it could have ended much worse. The police told me that these two had a history of violent crimes, including a robbery that had left one victim beaten in a parking lot for no apparent reason. Knowing how close I had come to being another one of their victims left me shaken to my core. I was grateful that I had managed to escape unharmed, but the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't acted quickly haunted me for days. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease every time I got behind the wheel for another delivery. The city that had once felt so familiar now seemed filled with hidden dangers, every shadow a potential threat. I eventually quit the job, unable to deal with the constant anxiety that had taken root in me. It was one of those nights when the rain falls like a relentless curtain, making everything beyond the windshield a blurry mess. I was driving home late from work, exhausted but relieved to be on my way. The radio was playing some old tunes, the kind that usually keeps me awake, but tonight, nothing seemed to help. The road was empty, just the way I liked it, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the rain pounded against the roof, or how the shadows seemed to dance just outside the reach of my headlights. I shrugged it off as fatigue and focused on the road ahead. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, soaked and shivering. My first instinct was to drive past. But something made me slow down. I pulled over, rolling down the window just enough to ask if they needed help. It was a woman, her hair plastered to her face, clothes clinging to her like a second skin. She looked at me with pleading eyes, and before I knew it, she was in the passenger seat, dripping water all over the upholstery. I tried to make small talk, but she barely responded, just stared straight ahead with those empty, hollow eyes. I continued driving, but the air in the car grew heavy, suffocating. I glanced over at her, and my heart skipped a beat. Her lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I turned up the radio to drown out the sound, but it only seemed to grow louder. She was speaking a language I didn't recognize, her voice growing more frantic, more desperate. The words clawed at my mind, sending shivers down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, trying to focus on the road. Then, without warning, she screamed, a blood-curdling, soul-piercing scream that filled the car and echoed in my ears. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the deserted road. The scream abruptly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I turned to her, but the passenger seat was empty. The door was still closed, and there was no sign of anyone ever being there. My heart raced as I searched the car, but it was just me, alone in the night. The radio flickered, the old tune distorting into static before a voice, clear and calm, came through the speakers. It was her voice, reciting something that felt like an incantation. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in," she whispered, over and over, until the words were all I could hear. In a panic, I floored the gas pedal, the car roaring to life as I sped down the rain-soaked road. The voice followed me, the whisper turning into a chant. Filling the car with an unbearable pressure, just as I thought I would lose my mind, the voice stopped. The radio returned to its usual static, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I dared a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, but there was nothing. I didn't slow down until I reached the lights of my hometown. I pulled into my driveway, heart still pounding, and sat there, trying to convince myself it was all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something chilling. The passenger seat, which had been soaked from the rain, was dry. Completely dry, as if no one had ever been there, and then I heard it, a whisper. Faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind, "Let me in." It was late, and I was on my way home after a long day of visiting a friend in a town about an hour away. The rain had started as a light drizzle but soon turned into a torrential downpour, making the road ahead barely visible. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine were the only sounds breaking the silence of the night. As I navigated a particularly dark stretch of road, I spotted something ahead, a man standing by the side, drenched and holding out his thumb, asking for a ride. His clothes clung to him, and his face was obscured by a hood. Everything about him screamed desperation. For a moment, I considered stopping. But something, a gut feeling, maybe, made me hesitate. There was something off about the way he stood, so still and rigid, despite the heavy rain. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I decided to drive past him, my headlights briefly illuminating his figure before it disappeared in the rearview mirror. I shook off the unease that crept up my spine and kept driving. After all, picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere, especially on a night like this, didn't seem like the smartest idea. But as I continued down the road, the memory of that lone figure began to gnaw at me. What if he really needed help? Before I could dwell on it, I saw him again. The same man, standing in the same spot on the side of the road. As if I had never passed him. I felt a chill run down my spine. It had to be a coincidence, maybe another hitchhiker, though that seemed unlikely in this weather. I pressed down on the accelerator, refusing to look back this time, but a few miles down the road, there he was again. The same man, with the same drenched clothes, standing with his thumb out. This time, I could see his face as I approached. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, and his expression was blank. Almost vacant. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped past him, my knuckles white from gripping the wheel so hard. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. How could he be ahead of me when I hadn't seen another car or turnoff in miles? I started to panic, the logical part of my brain clashing with the rising terror in my gut. I had to get out of there, get home, and forget this ever happened. I floored the gas pedal, the car roaring down the slick road, trying to outrun the nightmare unfolding around me. But no matter how fast I drove, how many turns I took, he kept appearing. Always ahead of me, always in the same spot, with the same blank stare and outstretched thumb. By now, I was trembling, cold sweat mixing with the rain on my face as I tried to figure out what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Or was something far worse at play? Finally, I saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead, and I swerved into the lot, nearly crashing into a pump as I slammed on the brakes. I sat there, breathing hard, trying to calm myself down. I was safe. I just needed to regroup, maybe call someone, and everything would be fine, but as I looked up, my blood ran cold. There he was, standing right outside the gas station, just beyond the glow of the lights. He didn't move, didn't come closer, he just stood there, watching me, waiting. I didn't dare get out of the car. I didn't even want to look at him anymore. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring back to life, and tore out of the gas station as fast as I could. For the rest of the drive, I kept expecting to see him again. But the road ahead remained empty. No more hitchhikers, no more eerie figures standing in the rain. I didn't slow down until I pulled into my driveway, the safety of my home finally within reach. As I stepped out of the car, I looked back one last time, half expecting him to be there, standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the sound of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I tried to convince myself it was over, that it was all just some strange hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, in the silence of my home, I heard it, the faint sound of knocking on the door. Slow, deliberate, and impossible. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew who it was. I knew if I opened that door, he'd be standing there, drenched and blank-eyed. With his thumb out, waiting for a ride that would never come, I backed away from the door, retreating to my room and locking it behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it echoed in my ears, but I never opened the door. I sat there, clutching the phone in my hand, waiting for the sound to stop. It took hours, maybe more, but eventually, the knocking faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even move until the first light of dawn crept through the window. Only then did I dare to check the door. There was no one there. No signs of anyone ever being there, but I knew better. I knew he was still out there, waiting, watching. Hoping for someone to pick him up, and I knew that if I ever drove down that road again, he'd be waiting for me. I was driving home after a long, grueling shift at work. The clock had struck midnight, and the only company I had was the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the wet asphalt and the occasional flash of my headlights slicing through the heavy rain. My mind was somewhere between exhaustion and the last dregs of caffeine, trying to navigate the empty roads that snaked through the dense forest. The night was pitch black, save for the sporadic bursts of lightning that briefly illuminated the surroundings. I took a deep breath and adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the silhouette of trees obscured by the downpour. Everything seemed eerily still, almost too still. It was the kind of silence that's heavy, unsettling, as if the world had paused just for me. As I approached a particularly winding stretch of road, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the highway, barely visible through the rain. It was a man, drenched and bedraggled, thumb outstretched in a classic hitchhiker's gesture. I didn't have time to stop. There were no streetlights around, and I could barely make out his features. I kept driving, feeling a twinge of guilt but rationalizing it as a matter of safety. There's something unnerving about picking up a stranger in the dead of night, especially in weather like this. As I glanced at the rearview mirror, I saw the figure fading into the darkness, lost behind me. A few minutes later, as I made a sharp turn, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. The figure was back, standing by the side of the road, exactly where I had seen him before. His thumb was still out, but his posture was different now, more assertive, almost demanding. My headlights barely touched him, but it was clear he had somehow reappeared. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or my weary mind playing tricks on me. But then, as I continued driving, I noticed something even more chilling. The car's temperature dropped noticeably, and the windows began to fog up despite the heater being on full blast. An uneasy shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the man had appeared again in the misty condensation of my back window, his eyes fixed on me through the fogged glass. My pulse quickened. I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of dread, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I sped up, my mind racing with thoughts of whether I should pull over and call for help or just keep driving. But the roads were desolate, and I didn't want to risk being stranded. Suddenly, the radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. A low, distorted voice came through, barely audible over the sound of the rain. It was saying my name, repeating it in a haunting, almost pleading tone. I turned off the radio, hoping to silence whatever was happening, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. In a panic, I glanced in the rearview mirror once more. The hitchhiker was now right behind my car, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and hollow. The sight was so disturbing that I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. I turned around, heart pounding, but when I looked back, the road was empty. No sign of the hitchhiker. The rain continued to batter the car, and the only sound was the rhythmic drip from the trees above. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady my breath. Finally, I mustered the courage to start the car again and slowly drove off, my eyes glued to the road ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking in the darkness just beyond my field of vision. When I finally reached home, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't explain what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget the cold, empty gaze of the hitchhiker in my rearview mirror. I didn't sleep that night, and even now, every time it rains, I can't help but feel that strange, unsettling presence lingering just beyond the reach of my headlights. If you're out driving in the dead of night and see someone on the side of the road, remember, sometimes, the things you don't see can be even more terrifying.